Sometimes you just need a big old sword that's great for slicing and dicing, as well as some good old-fashioned smashing and bashing. Well, this sword is it. This is the Twin Peaks Liao Dao by LK Chen. This is the Twin Peaks Liao Dao made by LK Chen, and it is a one-to-one recreation of an existing sword that came from the Khitan-Liao Dynasty that goes back over 1,000 years ago. It is a two-handed sword, but the handle is quite long, which offers a variety of gripping options. The blade is outstanding in appearance, with a big, wide, sweeping curve, and then of course, the twin peaks cresting on the spine. Even the sword fittings are unique in design, as we have the flat gourd-shaped pommel and the large persimmon leaf-shaped guard. This sword definitely fits into the big chopper category. It weighs just over 5 pounds, but even at that, the weight distribution and the handle make for a very maneuverable and lively sword. The blade is just over 29 inches and composed of a high-carbon manganese spring steel to withstand heavy target cutting. And there's quite a distal taper, from 12 millimeters at the guard all the way down to 3 millimeters at the tip. After the second peak, there's actually some slight beveling towards the spine as well, which makes less mass to clear through your target when cutting, making this a very efficient cutter. When you combine the handle length, the blade shape, the point of balance, and the moving weight of this sword, you have a very effective and formidable blade. The sword is from the Liao Dynasty, from 916 to 1125 CE, and existed during the same time of the Song Dynasty in China. Not to be confused with other nomadic tribes from the north, like the Jurchens, the Liao had their own sophisticated spoken and written language with a distinctly different script than Chinese characters. On the military side, they had adopted many of the weapons and defensive technologies of the previous Tang Dynasty in China, namely the heavy armored cavalry. Neighboring enemies like the Song and Jurchen also had special military divisions of heavy armored cavalry, with the armor covering both the horse and the rider. Each special heavy armored division had its own name, and as such was feared when participating in battle. The Song had the Silent Fortress Army, the Jurchens had the Iron Pagoda Army, and the Liao had the Iron Forest Army. This is not to say that they only relied on heavy cavalry. In fact, the majority of the army was built up of light cavalry, going in for the quick hit-and-run tactics of riding by and strafing with arrows. Now that's where this sword comes into play. Now, there's really two main factors that allow this sword to be so prominent. One was the use of the heavy armor. Because if you're using a two-handed sword, you don't have a free hand to hold a shield and protect yourself. So the body's going to be very vulnerable unless you cover it with heavy armor. Now, this is not a new concept for the Liao people, and this is something we've seen all the way back to the Han Dynasty with warriors using a two-handed Longjian and wearing heavy rhinoceros armor. Now, the second factor is the emphasis of heavy armored cavalry. You have to remember, at this time, both the horse and the rider were completely coated in armor. So to find any vulnerable points to attack are very, very limited. You've got the eyes and armpits of the rider, and for the horse, pretty much just their feet. So if you're on the ground, your best bet is to cut the foot of the horse to fall it and the rider and finish off the rider once they're on the ground. Now, this is no easy feat on the battlefield because you're going to be moving, you're in heavy armor, the other horse and the rider are in heavy armor, they're moving. There's a lot of unpredictable variables that are going on. But you don't really need to have a complete chop all the way through to have this be effective. Really, all you have to do is cut in enough to where the horse can no longer put weight on that foot. While they're moving, they're just going to end up dropping, and that's when you're going to be able to use this blade to its second advantage of just having that weight to it and chopping power. Now, it's important to remember that blades are not going to be very effective against lamellar armor. They're not just going to cut through the armor itself. So there was an extensive use on the battlefield of more heavy, blunt, impact-based objects. And we see this with short and long-handled maces that are more typically called in Chinese martial arts melon hammers. But the nice thing about this sword is when you're not using the blade for the slicing and dicing, you can switch it around and use the thick, heavy spines and the twin peaks as impact points for some good old-fashioned smashing and bashing. But enough about history. Let's talk about what you can expect if you pick up one of these bad boys for yourself from LK Chen. First off, it is a long sword with an overall length of 127 centimeters or 50 inches. But as I already mentioned, the long handle and the weight distribution really make for a very lively and maneuverable sword, which was quite surprising to me when I first held it. The blade has a bright polish, which contrasts beautifully with the blackened iron fittings and the dark wooden handle. The gourd-shaped pommel is flat and has a hole in the center, which was possibly used to pass some rope or string through to tie things on, or possibly to use as a slinging mechanism when carrying the sword. The pommel is not beveled or rounded, and in some places can be a bit sharp. Now, at first glance, you might think that this is actually going to be a big issue, but in my experience with this sword in cutting and forms training and just practicing techniques, I have never had my hand come down to even make contact with the pommel, and it's never been an issue of scratching or getting close to the body. So as long as you're sticking to the fundamentals and using the blade correctly, this won't be a big issue. The handle is a nice darkened hardwood with an ovular cross section, which although doesn't allow for precise edge indexing, it does allow for a comfortable grip, whether you're holding it forward for some slicing and dicing or you flip it around for that good old smashing and bashing. Now, the ting is full and goes all the way through and is secured by 2 pins in the handle. And as we get up to the top, we find an iron blade collar that has been shaped nicely so that there's really a seamless transition as we get up to the guard. The guard is the persimmon leaf shape with 4 lobes, and just like on the pommel of the sword, it doesn't have beveled edges here, so they are a little bit sharp, but I found that it's got so much coverage over the hand when holding the sword that there is really no contact to the corners, and again, that's not going to make much of an issue. And I find it, even when my hand is butting up against the guard, it's actually quite comfortable. There is a tongkou blade collar, which is very common for swords of the time, and was used to fortify the blade so that it wouldn't break against impact. Now on this particular sword, it has not been treated, so it does not have the same blackening as the guard, the collar right here, and the pommel, but I've seen it on the pictures on their website as well as other videos of people who have this sword. They are typically blackened, so it is very uniform with all the fittings on the sword. The blade itself is quite wide, and although we're used to seeing this particular shape when it comes to modern day kung fu weaponry, it was actually relatively new for the time. In fact, when we compare the Zhan Ma Dao of the Song Dynasty, we see a very contrasting appearance. Now, that's not to say that the Song didn't have curvy swords. In fact, they began to gain prominence around that time as the typical straight-back swords of the Tang and Sui were phased out. It's hard not to look at this blade and not instantly think of the legendary Green Dragon Crescent blade of Guan Yu. We see many similarities between this blade shape and how General Guan Yu and his legendary polearm were depicted. And that's most likely due to the novel, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, being published and illustrated in the Song Dynasty around the same time of this sword's existence. Although this shares the likeness of the Guan Dao, I wouldn't use it for Guan Dao training or techniques because those are all based on a long-handled polearm where, although this has a long handle, it's definitely not long enough. However, I found this to be a perfect fit for Choi Li Fut Zhan Ma Dao training and techniques, forms, and the like. And it really is natural because that's what this sword was used for. Now, I've found that this sword has exceptional balancing for upward cutting techniques and flowering techniques, which makes this one stand out quite a bit from the rest of the choppers from the LK Chen collection. The sword is also an effective cutter. I found that in my own personal training that this thing has been excellent and very efficient when cutting light and moderate targets. And I'm not the only one. There are many people that praise this sword for its control and its cutting efficiency when cutting light all the way up to heavy targets. Now, when it comes down to it, if you want a sword that is historically accurate, is an excellent cutter, and works well with traditional forms, training, and techniques, the sword checks all the boxes. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to leave the links to where you can pick this sword up and extra info down below in the description, as well as a couple of extra videos and other material that you might find interesting about the Liao people and the kingdom, as well as this sword itself. Now, if you have any questions or comments that you want to add, do so in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next.
Bam.